Morning, everyone. Thank you for being here on this slightly dreary morning. I think the rain's supposed to stop at some point, though, hopefully before we all leave. Like he said, I am a graduate student at Iowa State University, and I will be talking to you today on just a part of what my master's thesis was about. This talk is specifically nutritional enrichment to help improve the weaning transition of those nursery-aged swine. And I have to click to get it to go forward. So, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, the weaning transition in our commercial industry is a pretty stressful process for those little guys. They undergo a lot of different stressors, such as separation from the sow, transportation to a new facility, mixing with unfamiliar pigs, an abrupt transition from the milk to the solid diet. So all of these things just make it a pretty stressful process. And you can see I've highlighted some of the issues that can come about for those pigs that don't work well in that transition. So they can have increases in aggression, disease, gastrointestinal issues, decreases in growth and feed intake. And for those guys that really don't do the transition very well, you can also see increases in mortality. So environmental enrichment, the most basic definition of that is the use of environmental modifications to improve the biological functioning of captive animals. And I've shown just a few examples of its use in research projects and things like that in the swine industry in the past. It's very variable in its implementation, and some studies see positive results and others don't. So it's still like a new area that we want to kind of investigate because there's great potential there for helping these animals cope with their captive environments just a little bit better. There's 5 different kinds of environmental enrichment, and I'm going to focus this presentation on nutritional enrichment specifically, which is defined as providing just novel or varied feedstuffs to an animal. And the reason for this is that it's been suggested that if you can stimulate feed intake specifically in those first few days after weaning, you can really mitigate some of those issues such as growth and gastrointestinal issues and everything like that. There was also this really cool study done back in 2003 where they looked at just a variety of, I think it's 74 different kinds of enrichment, and they categorized those by what characteristics did the enrichment have, and then looked at what characteristics did the pigs like? What did they prefer to play with and mess around with? And they found certain things such as enrichment that was edible, scented, chewable, destructible, and deformable really gained and attracted their interest. And if you think about nutritional enrichment, it has all of those qualities. So it's really setting us up for success in the pig area. There was also another study done in 2019, which is the photos that you see up on the slide, where they provided what they called edible enrichment objects to the pigs just after they had been weaned. And they found that they consumed those a lot. They were really interested in it. They weren't really eating feed, but they ate the enrichment objects. So it's something that has the potential to really stimulate their interest in eating things right after the weaning transition. So keeping all this in mind, we had our research question of whether we can use all these desirable characteristics of nutritional enrichment to then stimulate recently weaned piglets to eat in their nursery environment. We had 3 specific objectives that we wanted to answer for this question. First was to evaluate the use of the enrichment with and without these. The fancy word is chemosensory stimuli, but the word I like to use is just attractants, things on there that they like. The second is to determine the impact of the enrichment presence on pig performance, feed intake, and fecal scores. And then third, we looked at feeding behavior at that feeder as well. So just a brief materials and methods. We had 470 pigs total that we used. They all came from the same source facility, and they were weaned between 19 and 24 days of age. And then we allocated them into 47 pens of 10 pigs each, splitting barrows and gilts 50-50 between those pens, but otherwise it was a random allocation. And there's just a few photos of our facility there. The enrichment itself, as I alluded to in the previous slides, a nutritional enrichment biscuit, and my professor is British, which is where the word biscuit comes from, and a difference to like a cookie, as most of us would immediately think. in this situation. And I've got some photos of the process of making that on the bottom of the slide. It was made from some like starter ingredients, so we wanted to make it as easy as possible. You didn't have to go out and find some random things you've never heard of. We got some dried whey powder and soybean oil, and then just a few things to help it come together into that biscuit format. We then took that and punched a hole in the middle of it so that we could like thread it onto a cotton string, and then there was a washer tied to the end which it rested on. I'm hitting my mic. So it was just really easy to put up there in the pen, tied it in place, put a piece of tape over it. And you can see we actually put it on the feeder itself so that it was hanging over the feed pan. We wanted to do everything we could to really draw them towards that feeder area and get them interested over there. And we also hung that biscuit at roughly eye level because there's some studies that see that clearly if they can see it, they're going to interact with it a little bit better. And finally, we replaced the biscuit itself on the end of that rope every day for the first 7 days after weaning, and then we took the whole thing down after that. So treatments, which I kind of alluded to in my attractants thing earlier, we had a negative control where no enrichment was added to the pen or the feeder at all. Those pigs were left alone. A positive control where we had a biscuit threaded on our rope, hung up, and it was plain. There was nothing fancy on it. Next was a strawberry jam. So you can see that photo at the top where it was just strawberry jam with a little bit of water to make it consistent. You could actually dip stuff in it. And that was the end of the biscuit was dipped in that before placement. And then there was this really cool paper that looked at what they call the semiochemical. Is basically based on some sow pheromones that they used in the nursery before. And so we used that as our final treatment. So we collected a couple of different measures. First was feed intake, so we can calculate average daily feed intake over that first week period. We looked at average daily gain, collected fecal scores, which on the bottom of the slide, you can see a photo of what that scale was, just 0 to 3, depending on the consistency of the feces. And then we also had cameras up so that we could collect behavioral measures, specifically interaction with the feeder itself and interaction with the enrichment hung up on the feeder. First, getting into average daily gain, we found that treatment was not a source of significant variation. And if you're looking at the graph to the bottom, I just kind of quickly want to point out that this pattern or format of the graph is going to be continued through this presentation. So we've got our treatments color-coded along that bottom axis, and then the measure of interest is going to be on the y-axis to the side. So not significant with a p-value of 0.71, but a fecal score as well. The average fecal score was 2 across all pens, all days, all treatments. So from this, we were able to see that there was no negative impacts on fecal scores, which is important when you're putting in some nutritional thing in there. How does it impact them? And average daily gain from that enrichment presence. In terms of average daily feed intake, we did see a slight trend, so a p-value of 0.09, with the jam treatment having just slightly lower average daily feed intake compared to the semiochemical and the negative control treatments. In terms of morbidity and mortality, we only had 1 pig die during the whole nursery phase, and that happened on day 20. And then there were 5 that had been identified as unthrifty or failure to thrive, and they had been removed to the hospital pen. Those removals occurred after the day 7, so the first 7 days when we had our enrichment in there. So the fact that none of these removals or deaths occurred during our enrichment period, oops, one too many, led us to at least conclude there's no short-term impacts on morbidity or mortality. Getting into the interaction with the enrichment device itself, and I don't know if any of you have any experience with watching behavior, but it takes a lot of time. So we actually focused in specifically on the first hour after we placed that nutritional enrichment biscuit in every day, because we really just wanted to get their first reaction to what do they think of this thing that we've put in their environment. So on the left, we have the results on day 0. So we weaned them into the pens, we did some processing, we put the biscuits up, and we started the cameras, and immediately, what did they think about those? And you could see that the jam treatment actually in that middle column had a pretty high level of interaction, and this is in terms of how many pigs in the pen approached and touched that biscuit in our hour of observation, and we had 80% of them within the first hour of placement. They were up there, they were interacting with that enrichment device, which was pretty cool to see. On the right, we have the 7-day average. So instead of focusing in on just day 0, all days that we had them in there, averaging how many pigs in each of our treatment pens touched that enrichment device and approached that enrichment device. On the far right, the purple column, you can see that 80% on average in all of those treatments, 8 out of 10 pigs came up and they played with it and they touched it and they chewed on it. And again, the jam treatment with that gray bar was slightly higher than those other ones. Finally, we looked at kind of what I call a biscuit disappearance rate. So when I came in the next morning, the first thing I did was I walked through and I just looked at all of my ropes and said, are there any biscuits left on those ropes? And there was only biscuits left 4 times. So out of 245 observations, meaning I had X number of ropes and X number of pens and X number of days, the biscuit was completely gone, no evidence of it anywhere in the pen, 98.4% of the time, which is pretty exciting to see. They were interacting with this, and anecdotally, so me going in and seeing, I saw them chewing on it and playing with it. So they really loved this biscuit that we put in there. So from this, we're able to conclude that the enrichment was of high interest to the pigs, and that jam was just a little bit more interesting to them, especially looking at that day 0 interaction. Going into feeder interactions, again, focusing in on the first hour after we put the biscuit in every day. On the left, we have the frequency of feeder interactions, and we define that as they approached the feeder, they put their head over the feed pan, and then they actually lowered their head and snout down into the feed pan. We wanted to get as exact as we could with what a feeder interaction was. And then on the other side, we have duration of interactions. And what I really want to point out here is that that blue bar, that negative control, no biscuit in the pen, had a lower duration and frequency of interactions compared to all 3 of our enrichment treatments. So whatever was going on in their head, they saw that enrichment hung up on the feeder and they said, hey, I'm going to go over there, and it translated to more time spent with their head in the feeder itself. So some take-home messages for you guys. First, as I said, the enrichment itself was highly attractive. They interacted with it fast, they interacted with it quickly, and it was gone 24 hours. I came in, I could not see anything. I had to put in a new biscuit every single day. It did increase their interest in the feeder, as seen by the more time with their head spent in the feeder. So we do have some future work planned to try and see, okay, they like it, they put their heads in the feeder with it, can we get the numbers to really dig into average daily feed intake and average daily gain? Because this was a small kind of pilot or study, so we've got our yes, they like it, and there's potential, now let's go and take it out to the larger scale. And we also were able to just increase animal welfare. If you think of an enriched environment, that's something that a lot of consumers are looking for now. So we've put something in here that is improving the quality of life of those pigs, something they want to play with and enjoy. It's in giving them a little bit more of a welfare-friendly environment as well. And that's the end.